Chapter 17, The Festival, 1938. Friedrich had met me on the street. "Come," he'd said, making me curious. "You'll see something very special." I had gone with him, even though I had to keep thinking of my father. Only a week ago, he had begged me, "Don't show yourself so often with the Schneiders, otherwise I'll have difficulties." Now we stood in the large room of the synagogue, Herr Schneider, Friedrich, and I. Friedrich and his father wore their best suits, while I looked shabby in my everyday clothes. Gradually, the bench in front of us filled up. Men with hats on their heads shook hands with us and wished us Gut Shabbos. All found an extra word of kindness for Friedrich or patted his shoulder. One by one, everyone lifted his seat, revealing a small compartment underneath. Friedrich took a large white scarf from his, as well as a prayer book and his yarmulke, exchanging the latter for his cap. He touched the fringed scarf with his lips and draped it around my shoulders. "My tallis, my prayer shawl," he whispered to me. A man wearing a black hat and a long black coat that reached to his feet walked to a podium in the center of the room. The podium was covered with a carpet. He opened a thick book from the back and immediately began to chant a prayer. "Our rabbi," Friedrich informed me in a low voice. Then he, too, opened his prayer book and prayed in Hebrew. From time to time, he interrupted the rabbi's prayer with an interjection, and at one point he seemed to start a completely different prayer. I was astonished. How did Friedrich know Hebrew so well? He had never told me anything about it. Suddenly he seemed like one of the many adults around us. From time to time he looked up from his prayer book and nodded to me. The rabbi prayed facing the east. Swaying back and forth, he kept making small bows to the east wall, which was covered with a red curtain. This curtain was embroidered with Hebrew characters. Otherwise, there wasn't a single picture in the room. No ornament, only large, many-branched candelabras with candles in them. From a side balcony, the women watched the service. While I was still examining the inside of the synagogue, the voices of the congregation merged with the rabbis. The chant grew louder. With measured steps, the rabbi walked to the curtain. The red velvet was pulled aside. Behind it, a small door in the wall could be seen. The rabbi opened the door, then stood aside so everyone could look into the box. "That's our Torah inside the ark," Friedrich explained. The Torah was wrapped in a cloth decorated with a silver crown and shield. The rabbi lifted the heavy scrolls out of the ark. In solemn procession, he carried them through the synagogue. Wherever he passed, members of the congregation left their seats, touched the Torah with their talisim, and then touched the talisim to their lips. "Now comes the surprise," Friedrich told me. He seemed very excited. Herr Schneider pulled Friedrich to him and soothingly patted his shoulder and stroked his hair. At the podium, the crown, the shield, and the cloth were removed from the Torah and the great parchment placed on the podium. One after the other, the rabbi called 7 congregants to the podium. Then he called Friedrich. Herr Schneider put both hands on his shoulders. Proudly, he looked into his son's eyes before sending him on his way. The rabbi also greeted Friedrich much more solemnly than he had the men before him. "For the first time in his life, he's been called to read the weekly section," Herr Schneider proudly told me. "Afterwards, he's also permitted to read a section from the prophets." Like the men before him, Friedrich touched the Torah with his talus, and instructed by the rabbi, he kissed the talus. Then he recited the blessing. But while the prayer leader had chanted a Torah section with each of the men before him, Friedrich took over the silver staff, led it along the lines from right to left, and chanted his section of the Torah by himself. Then he read the last section quickly and surely. He touched the last passage one more with his talus and the talus to his lips. While the scrolls of the Torah were again wrapped in their ornaments, Friedrich read this section from the prophets from a large book. He returned to his seat. Just at the beginning of the service, the rabbi carried the Torah in procession through the synagogue, and again the congregants pressed toward it. The rabbi replaced the Torah in the ark, and then another prayer before closing the little door. Then he gave a short sermon. For the first time since I had entered the synagogue, he spoke in German. The sermon was directed solely at Friedrich. It singled him out before the whole congregation. Men kept looking at Friedrich, nodding to him with smiles of well wishes. "Today, a week after your 13th birthday," the rabbi said, You have, for the first time in your life, been called upon to read a section from the Torah. This is an honor for every Jew, but the day on which this happens for the first time is a special day. With it begins a new phase of your life. From now on, you alone will be responsible to the Lord our God for your deeds. Until this day, your father has borne this responsibility, but from now on, you stand among us as an equal member of this congregation. Remember that. Obey the commandments of the Lord. No one can take away your guilt if you break them. You are assuming a difficult duty in a difficult time. We are chosen by the Lord our God to be guided back into our homeland by the Messiah and there to help found his kingdom. But God has placed the heavy burden of persecution upon us until this day. We must continually remind ourselves that the Lord our God has determined this fate. We must not and cannot escape it, and even when we feel we will collapse under it, reflect. The Holy Torah demands. And the rabbi finished his sermon with a sentence in Hebrew. Soon afterward, the service closed with a communal song. I waited outside the synagogue for Friedrich and his father. There were so many questions I was burning to ask, but there was no opportunity. All of the men from the congregation came over and congratulated Friedrich. One could see how proud he felt. After that, the woman had also left the synagogue. We went home in a flock of relatives and friends. Frau Schneider had run ahead. She received us by the door and led us all into the living room, where she had arranged a festive Sabbath feast. There was plenty of everything. But before the feast could begin, Friedrich gave a speech, just like a grown-up orator. Dear father, dear mother, dear relations, he began, the Lord has ordered us to honor mother and father so that we may long live in the land that he has given us. May he forgive me for not allowing this commandment sufficiently until this day. For 13 years, dear parents, you've instructed me and guided me in the commandments of our Lord, through the good times and bad. It is thanks to you who have stood by me that I today have been received into the congregation. In my thoughts and my duties, I will show myself worthy of this honor and duty. May the Lord grant you, dear parents and relations, 120 years of healthy and joyful life, so that I might find time to repay the thanks that I owe you. Frau Schneider wept. Herr Schneider looked at the floor, absent-mindedly rummaging in his jacket pocket. When Friedrich finished his speech, everyone applauded, and his father presented him with a wristwatch. The other guests had brought presents, too. Tell me, I asked Friedrich in a whisper, where did you learn all that? The Hebrew and the speech? Friedrich smiled proudly. Learned it. Had to practice my Torah section and the speech for almost 3 months. I showed my astonishment. Friedrich enjoyed it. Shall I tell you what Friedrich is in Hebrew? He asked me. I nodded. Solomon, Friedrich told me, laughing. While we ate, the doorbell rang. I wonder who would come this late, Frau Schneider asked, puzzled. She went to the door and opened it. Herr Neudorf, his former teacher, came into the room. He wished Friedrich all the best on his bar mitzvah. Then he gave him a fountain pen. Friedrich's name had been engraved in gold on the cap.